Welcome to an introduction to economics, brought to you by Parkbench Tutors and narrated by David Hopcroft. For more information about Parkbench Tutors, please visit parkbenchtutors.com. This short podcast will introduce some simple ideas that are associated with economic theory put forward by Karl Marx. You should remember that Marx wrote much of his work in German, and that a great deal of the available literature is actually based on Engels' interpretation of his notes. This means we should be aware of differences between what is said and what is described as Marxist theory. You should also be aware that Marx's writing needs to be viewed in a correct historical context. Just as Thomas Malthus, a political economist, forecast gloom with his ideas about population growth before the Industrial Revolution improved methods of food production, much of what Marx saw and wrote about was influenced by factory conditions in Victorian times. Marx was clearly influenced by Hegel, whose work included use of dialectic. This is the idea that a thesis has a contrary or counter-antithesis, and that these eventually come together as a synthesis of opposing views. Hegel used the term sublation for this coming together. Marx had a materialistic view of history, which he perceived as being a long process of class struggle that was following a path that could be seen as the end to this class struggle. Marx believed he could recognize a number of different stages in the development of human society. The most primitive of these was the commune, or communal society, where there was a degree of cooperation for hunting and gathering. He assumed there was no class division here. His description related to a past. The tribes who live in some of the more remote regions of the world could not be described as at this stage of development. This led to a society where some members were slaves to others. Slavery was a result of warfare, and slaves worked only for food and had no freedom. The class who controlled the slaves was seen as exploiting them. Marx, of course, was familiar with the history of the treatment of those who had been conquered by Greek and Roman civilizations. He then saw a stage that he describes as being feudalism, where land is owned and divided between members of an upper class. This class consisted of royalty and nobles. Beneath them was a class that were known as serfs. Serfs applied their labour to the nobles and also paid taxes. Any surplus became the property of the nobles or the church. He groups the clergy, merchants and craftsmen together as separate from serfs, since they are not bound in the same way to nobles. Finally, he describes the society he sees around him as being a capitalist mode of production. We should note he did not actually use the word capitalism. This involved two classes: the bourgeoisie, the rich and upper class, and the proletariat, or workers. The upper class owned the means of production and invested capital to produce goods and services with the objective of making a profit. Marx uses the idea of commodities in his explanation of a capitalist mode of production. Commodities are bought and sold on the market, and human labour could be bought and sold like any other commodity. All production was to produce commodities which, in simple form, was exchanged for money, the money then being used to buy another commodity. However, he suggested there is now a further development. Money is used to produce a commodity which is then sold for an increased amount of money. The increase represented surplus value, or what we might term the profit. Marx explains surplus value by stating that all commodities have two values. The first he refers to as the use value, which is a direct value to the consumer, such as the energy benefit from food or the warmth from a thick winter coat. The second is the exchange value, what one commodity is worth in terms of another commodity, such as being able to exchange, let's say, a pair of boots for 2 sacks of potatoes. He realized that the use value never really changed, but the exchange value could vary. He then needed to work out what might determine an exchange value, and came to the conclusion that it depended upon the amount of labour needed to make a product. Interestingly, his idea never considered the value of the raw materials. If it took an hour to make a spade, but 6 hours to make the coat, then he had an exchange value idea that could be applied to all goods. Now, Marx was not promoting an idea of bartering. He saw that the value could be represented by money that could then be used for exchange. He then regarded capital as being money taken out of circulation, since it could no longer be used for exchange. He now had to determine how capital could accrue the surplus value. Marx explained surplus value as the difference between labour power and labour. The factory owner buys labour power, but labour is the actual work done to make a commodity. Let us give a simple example. If a worker is employed for 10 hours a day at a daily or hourly rate, but the commodity can be made in 6 hours, then the 4 hours that the labourer works represents surplus value. So if this is multiplied by the number of workers in the factory, then this represents the profit that can be made. Let's give it some numbers. If the commodity has a value of $50 and the worker works for 10 hours and makes $50, but the commodity is actually made in 6 hours, then it is clear what Marx was thinking. There were 4 hours of labour that represented the surplus value, which was $20. Since the capitalist mode of production was to make a profit, then the question would arise, how can we increase surplus value? There are 3 ways of doing this. Increasing efficiency through mechanization would allow the product to be made in a shorter time. Marx would have observed the mechanization taking place in factories during his lifetime. Reducing wages and increasing competition for jobs would also increase surplus value. The elimination of competitors would increase surplus value, since the factory would make more of the commodity. Marx now made some predictions from his theory. He believed that wages would fall, but also that profit would fall due to the instability of the system. He predicted there would only be a few large companies. The numbers of the working class would increase. There would be a series of economic crises, and these would result in revolution by workers to end the system. How did Marx explain the idea of repeated economic crises? Well, higher wages would lead to higher prices, and that would mean there would be lower profits. So wages would then have to be lowered. This would reduce consumption and lead to unemployment. The result would be a series of boom and bust cycles. The economist Keynes also saw this paradox, that there was a cycle of events. To avoid the boom and bust cycle, Marx proposed a system of social production was adopted, with needs determined and production controlled to meet those needs. This contrasted with the free market idea. He saw the free market as failing because goods were produced that were wasted or unsold, and so the labour used in producing these goods was wasted. The commodities that were sold should be the cheapest. Marx suggested that capital would be accumulated, part being used for investment needed for growth. But if the demand fell, then investment would fall, and this would produce a slump. Overproduction and piles of unsold goods are sometimes the sign of such a slump. Marxist economics suggested centralization of essential industry, with only useful goods and services produced. Banks would be under central control, and this would control investment. Finally, imports would be controlled to prevent unemployment. Was Marx correct? We can see some features in capitalist society which he predicted. There have been boom and bust cycles, some with large numbers being unemployed. There has been a growing gap between rich and poor, though there have been some short periods when the gap has seemed to narrow for a while. However, in real terms, wages have improved. People are better off in terms of material wealth. and profits did not continue to fall, although they did vary with boom and bust cycles. The only areas where Marx's ideas were tried were communist countries. These countries also seem to have suffered recessions, and central control of production led to more shortages than surplus for most commodities. Whilst unemployment has not been high in those countries, wages have not been high, many commodities were not available, and interestingly, a class hierarchy or class system still evolved between party officials and the workers. This ends our short podcast on the ideas of Marx, brought to you by Parkbench Tutors and narrated by David Hopcroft. Thank you for watching and for listening. We wish you success in your studies. For more information on Parkbench Tutors, please visit parkbenchtutors.com.